In the photos, she looked like an ordinary mother, smiling, hugging her family, posing at holiday gatherings. Neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who didn't socialize much with anyone, but didn't cause problems either. And it was these very photos that would later be shown on the news across America when it was revealed exactly what she kept in her apartment. But that moment was still a long way off. Detroit, autumn 2015. The east side of the city, a neighborhood where half the houses are boarded up. And the other half, frankly, probably should be too. Two bailiffs drive up to an apartment building on Martin Street. It's a standard call: eviction for unpaid rent. The tenant hadn't paid for 4 months. The court had issued a ruling, and now they needed to document the condition of the premises and hand the keys over to the owner. They go on 3 or 4 of these calls a week. It's absolute routine. The second-floor apartment. The door turned out to be unlocked. They pushed it, and it opened. No one was inside. The woman had moved out on her own without waiting for the bailiffs, which was also a common occurrence. People don't want to watch the belongings being carried out onto the street, so it's easier to leave ahead of time. The apartment looked as though they had left in a hurry. Some of the furniture remained: a saggy sofa, a couple of chairs, a table. Trash, bags, and some rags were on the floor. Dirty dishes were in the sink. It smelled of stale air and something else, but the bailiffs didn't immediately realize what it was. Next was the standard procedure: go through all the rooms, take photos, make an inventory. The kitchen was empty, the bathroom too. In the bedroom, there was a mattress on the floor and a pile of clothes in the closet. In the younger children's room, there were 2 beds and scattered toys. It was clear that a family had lived here. But where they were now was no longer the bailiff's concern. When they returned to the living room, one of them noticed a large chest freezer against the far wall near the window. White, old, and humming. It was running, which meant the electricity hadn't been shut off yet. A freezer during an eviction is always a separate issue. Food might be left inside, which would spoil and stink up the entire place. So, checking it was mandatory. The bailiff walked closer. The lid was heavy, frozen shut at the edges. He pulled harder and opened it. Inside lay 2 bundles, black trash bags tightly wrapped with duct tape, large, oblong, and irregularly shaped. They lay on top of each other, covered in a layer of frost. The first thought that comes in such a situation is meat. People sometimes buy in bulk and store whole carcasses, or hunters who have venison or pork. That would be a perfectly logical explanation for a freezer in the middle of a living room. The bailiff pulled the edge of a bag to see what was inside. The plastic had stiffened from the cold and wouldn't yield easily. He pulled harder, and the bag split at the seam. A foot appeared through the tear. A human foot, a small one. He jerked his hand back and stepped away. For a few seconds, he just stood and stared, trying to process exactly what he was seeing. Then he turned to his partner and told him to call the police. The patrol arrived 11 minutes later. Forensics followed. The apartment was immediately cordoned off. The bailiffs were taken into the hallway to give statements. From that moment on, the freezer was opened as part of the investigative team's work. When they unwrapped the first bundle, they found a curled-up figure inside. Knees pulled to the chest, arms pressed to the body. Everything was completely frozen, covered in ice crystals. It looked very young. The second bundle, the same thing. Only the figure was noticeably larger. a teenager. 2. Both had clearly been lifeless for a long time, both hidden in a freezer that stood in an ordinary residential apartment where, judging by the toys in the children's room, someone had lived very recently. And so, what began as a routine eviction for non-payment of rent instantly turned into a discovery case. Forensics set to work, and the investigators were faced with the first and main task: to find the woman who lived there. The same one who smiled in the family photos scattered around the apartment. The one who had quietly moved out a few days before the bailiffs arrived, leaving behind dirty dishes, toys, and a freezer that no one was supposed to look into. The tenant's identity was established that same day. The lease agreement, utility bills, court documents for the eviction, everything was under one name. Mitchelle Brown, 35 years old, a mother of 4, all by different fathers. None of the men in her life had stayed for long. They checked the databases. Unemployed, living on welfare and food stamps. In the last 6 months, she had stopped paying rent and had accumulated a debt of several $1,000s. The owner sued, and the court ruled for eviction. For this neighborhood, the story was absolutely standard, nothing unusual. And here was the main question. In the system, Mitchelle Brown was listed as having 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. They found 2 in the freezer. Where the other 2 were, at that moment, no one knew. Investigators began interviewing neighbors. The testimonies were almost identical. A quiet family that kept to themselves. The mother hardly spoke to anyone and didn't seek contact. The younger children sometimes appeared in the yard, but rarely. In the last few months, no one had seen them at all. But, characteristically, none of the neighbors gave it much thought. In such neighborhoods, people are used to not minding other people's business. Everyone has enough problems of their own. One neighbor remembered hearing screams from that apartment a few times, loud ones, but he couldn't make out exactly what was being yelled. The walls were thin, and sounds traveled through the whole building. He decided then that it was an ordinary family quarrel. Everyone has them, and this "everyone has them" would later resonate in the case files as an example of why no one noticed anything in time. Meanwhile, forensics finished the preliminary examination. Both had been lifeless for a long time. Not days or weeks, months and possibly years. Only an autopsy could tell for sure. But even at this stage, it was clear that the discovery had been in the freezer for a very long time. Police put Mitchelle Brown on the wanted list. Simultaneously, the search for the remaining 2 began. Because if 2 were in the freezer, where the other 2 were, and whether they were even alive, was a question that needed to be answered as quickly as possible. They found her the very next day, and characteristically, they didn't even really have to look for her because she wasn't hiding. Mitchelle was living at the other end of Detroit, renting a room in the house of an acquaintance. When the police knocked on the door, she opened it herself. The 2 younger children were with her, a son and a daughter, both alive. Mitchelle didn't resist, didn't scream, didn't try to run. She silently held out her hands for the handcuffs. And as she was being led to the police car, she didn't look back at her family even once. Not a single look back, not a word of farewell. She just got into the car, and that was it. The younger children were immediately handed over to social services. A medical examination showed they were physically unharmed. No signs of abuse, starvation, or visible trauma. They were fed, clothed, and looked normal, if that word could even be applied to such a situation. But the eldest daughter was acting strangely. She didn't cry and didn't ask questions about what was happening. She just sat motionless, staring at one spot. When a social worker tried to talk to her, she flinched as if she had been hit. It wasn't just typical teenage withdrawnness. It was something else. The doctor recorded her condition as an acute stress reaction. She understood where she was and could answer simple questions. But something inside her seemed to have shut down, and it wasn't possible to break through that wall immediately. Investigators decided not to push. She was given 24 hours in the hospital under the supervision of a psychologist. Yes, they needed testimony, needed details of what happened in that apartment, but not at any cost, especially since she herself could turn out to be a victim, and treating her like an ordinary witness would be wrong. On the second day, she asked to talk. She said she was ready to tell. From that moment on, the investigation had its first person who could explain exactly what was happening behind the closed doors of the apartment on Martin Street. A person who lived inside this nightmare and somehow survived. The interrogation took place in the hospital, in a private room. An investigator, a psychologist, and a recording camera in the corner were present. She sat on a chair, hands resting calmly on her knees. She spoke quietly, almost without expression, as if reading a text she had memorized a long time ago. At first, there were general questions. Her name, where she studied. She answered briefly, but clearly. And then, the investigator asked about her brother and sister, the ones found in the freezer. She fell silent for a long time. The psychologist wanted to intervene, to offer encouragement, but the investigator stopped him with a gesture. Sometimes you just need to give a person time. And then she spoke. She said she was home when the irreparable happened to her brother. She saw how it happened. She saw what her mother had done to him before that. And it wasn't about one day. It had gone on for weeks. The investigator asked about her sister. She nodded. She saw that too. She was home then too. It happened about a year after her brother. The same scheme, the same scenario, the same end. She remembered everything, every day of those weeks. What her mother said, what she did, how it all ended, and what happened after, when the bundle ended up in the freezer and life in the apartment continued as if nothing had happened. Breakfasts, dinners, TV in the evenings, ordinary family life, except that her brother lay in the freezer against the wall. For 3 years, she lived with this knowledge. She went to school, did her homework, talked to her classmates, and all that time, she kept silent. The investigator asked the question he couldn't help but ask. Why didn't she tell anyone sooner? Teachers, neighbors, police, and anyone. She looked at him as if he had asked something completely obvious. And she answered with a single sentence that made the room go silent. Because then, I would have been the next one in that freezer. The investigator asked her to tell everything from the beginning. She nodded and started with her brother. March 2012. And so, it all started with some trifle. He did something wrong. She didn't remember exactly what. Maybe he didn't clean up after himself. Maybe he snapped back in response to a remark. The mother got angry. At first, it was an ordinary punishment. No dinner. This had happened before. No one was particularly surprised. But the next day, The mother didn't give him breakfast or lunch either. She said that until he understood his behavior, he would get nothing. He asked for food. She wouldn't give him any. 3 days later, he started taking food himself, secretly, at night, when everyone was asleep. His mother caught him doing it, and after that, everything became much worse. She started locking him in a room. She tied his hands so he couldn't get out. She let him out only for the bathroom, and even then, not every time he asked. The daughter saw this every day. She heard him crying behind the closed door, heard him asking for food, for water, asking to be let out. How he gradually went quiet because there was no strength left to scream. Weeks went by, one after another. He grew weak before her eyes. At first, he stopped crying. There was simply no strength. Then he stopped asking. He just lay in the room and was silent. The mother would go into him and check. Sometimes she used force, for something only she could see. She said he had to understand that it was all for his own good, that she was doing what any normal mother should do. And these words about a normal mother would later sound particularly horrific in the case files, considering what lay behind them. And then one morning, she went into his room and came out a minute later. Her face was absolutely calm, no emotion. She walked up to her daughter and told her to bring trash bags. He was no longer moving. The one who a few weeks ago had simply displeased his mother in some way had stopped breathing. From that moment on, life in the apartment on Martin Street began a life in which the freezer by the wall kept a terrible secret. And those who remained pretended that nothing had happened, because they simply had no other choice. The mother wrapped him herself. 2 trash bags, duct tape, the cold floor. She worked calmly and methodically, as if she had done it before. The daughter stood in the doorway and watched. Her mother didn't drive her away. On the contrary, she asked her to help hold the edge of the bag. The freezer was already in the living room. Before, they used it to store meat, frozen vegetables, and leftovers. The mother pulled everything out, making space. She put the bundle on the bottom and closed the lid. Then she turned to her daughter and said, "Forget it. There was no brother. If anyone asks, he went to live with relatives. Understand?" The daughter nodded. She understood. And from that moment, her life began, in which she had to walk past that freezer every day and pretend that it just contained food. The next year passed almost normally. School, home, TV in the evenings. The mother got some part-time job, then quit. Money was constantly tight, but they managed somehow. The younger brother was growing up and knew nothing. They tried to keep him away from everything that was happening. The older sister, the one who would also end up in the freezer later, was still alive at that moment. In May 2013, it all happened again. Again, some trifle. Again, something was wrong. The daughter couldn't remember exactly what the reason was. The mother started with the same thing. No dinner, then no breakfast. Then the room, ropes, complete isolation. And it was then that it became clear this was no accident or breakdown. The scheme worked like a fine-tuned mechanism. The same words, the same actions, the same predictable finale. Weeks turned into a month. The sister weakened, went quiet, stopped asking for food and water. Everything followed the already familiar scenario. The one giving testimony watched what was happening again. Heard again how someone was crying and asking behind the door. was silent again because she knew to intervene meant taking the victim's place. She had seen once where it ended. Now she was seeing it again and understood the outcome would be the same. When her mother came out of the room with the same calm face as last time, she wasn't even surprised. She just silently went to get the trash bags because she knew what would happen next. The second bundle lay in the freezer on top of the first. The lid closed, and life in the apartment on Martin Street once again went on as usual, as if nothing had happened. Only now there were 2 in the freezer. Life after that continued. And that was the strangest thing. It just continued, as if nothing had changed. The freezer stood in the living room, against the wall opposite the sofa, white, pulky, constantly humming. They walked past it to the kitchen. They sat near it and watched TV. 2 meters away from it, the family sat down for dinner. An ordinary household item that just stood in its place and didn't bother anyone. The mother forbade opening it. She didn't explain why. She just forbade it, and that was it. The daughter already knew the reason, but the younger brother knew nothing. For him, there was another version. The brother and sister had gone to live with some distant relatives, somewhere far away. They would return someday. He sometimes asked about them. For the first few months, he asked often, then less and less. Then he stopped completely. People get used to everything, to the absence of loved ones too, especially when adults pretend everything is fine. 3 years, more than 1,000 days. The daughter woke up, had breakfast, went to school, returned home, did her homework, had dinner, and went to bed. The freezer hummed in the living room. That sound became part of the background, like the noise of a refrigerator or the ticking of a clock. She learned not to hear it, learned not to think about what lay inside, learned to walk past without turning her head or lingering her gaze. And what is important to understand, the neighbors noticed nothing in all those 3 years. Not once did anyone ask where 2 of the family members had gone. In this neighborhood, people appeared and disappeared constantly, moving to other cities, going to relatives, ending up in shelters or the foster care system. One more, one less. No one counted or kept track. The mother behaved as usual all this time. Cooked food, cleaned the apartment, argued about bad grades. Sometimes she snapped, screamed, could hit for some offense, but not like back then. Not according to that scheme of hunger and isolation that had twice ended tragically. The daughter waited. Every day she woke up and waited for it to start again. For her mother one day to look at her with that same gaze she had already seen twice. To say the familiar, "No dinner tonight." And then the same mechanism would be triggered that had already taken her brother and sister. But it didn't happen. Not yet. And this waiting, stretched over 3 years, was even scarier than if everything had happened at once. The investigator asked, 3 years? And in all that time, not a word to anyone? She shook her head. Not a single word. And here it is important to understand that she had moments when she wanted to tell. Once at school, a teacher asked if everything was all right at home. She opened her mouth to answer and immediately closed it. She said, "Yes, everything is fine." The teacher nodded and moved to the next question. She never asked again. There was also a school psychologist. Once a year, there was a mandatory conversation, 5 minutes for each student. Standard questions. How are you? How are your studies? Are there any problems at home or at school? She sat opposite him and thought, What would happen if I told the truth? Right now, to this person? He would write down her words, call whoever needed to be called. The police would come. And then what? She imagined returning home after such a conversation. How her mother would open the door. How she would look at her. Her mother would definitely find out that the daughter had told someone. If not from the police, then from the neighbors, from social services, from anyone. In such neighborhoods, news travels fast. Everyone knows everything. And then she would be next. This wasn't just fear or a guess. Her mother had told her directly, even after the first time. She came up in the evening, when the younger ones were already asleep. She looked her in the eyes. Her voice was calm, casual, as if she were talking about a shopping list or plans for tomorrow. If you tell anyone, you'll lie down right next to him. The daughter knew what was in the freezer, knew how it got there, saw the whole process with her own eyes, and she understood that her mother wasn't joking or scaring her. She was just explaining how everything was now arranged in their family. New rules that couldn't be broken. After the second time, when the sister was put in the freezer, the mother said nothing. There was no need to repeat the threat. The daughter understood everything by then without words. She saw what her mother was capable of and knew that those words were not an empty threat, but a very real scenario that could be realized at any moment. And that is exactly why she was silent for 3 years. She went to school, talked with teachers and classmates, answered the psychologist's questions, and each time she chose silence. Because the price of words was too high. Telling the truth meant signing her own death warrant. Mitchelle Brown was interrogated the day after her arrest. A private room, an investigator, a lawyer, a camera in the corner. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. She entered calmly, sat on a chair, and put her hands on the table. She waited for questions, looking as if she had come for a job interview. Not an interrogation about a case regarding what happened to her own children. The investigator started with formalities: name, age, home, address. She answered in a steady voice, without pauses or hesitation. Then they moved to the heart of the matter. 2 people were found in the freezer in your apartment. Do you know who they are? Mine. Do you know how they ended up there? I put them there. The lawyer flinched, wanted to say something, maybe stop her or ask for a break for a consultation. She paid no attention to him. She continued to look at the investigator. Her gaze was direct, unblinking, absolutely calm. The investigator clarified. Did she understand what she had just said? Did she understand that it was a confession? She nodded. Yes, she understood. He asked exactly how it had all happened. She answered that it was punishment. They had behaved badly, and she was punishing them. At some point, they stopped breathing. That was the whole explanation. A few sentences spoken in the same tone she had used a minute ago to give her home address. And it is important to note, her voice didn't falter once during the entire conversation. Not a shadow of remorse, not a hint of emotion. She spoke of what had happened as if she were describing a mundane household situation not worth much attention. The investigator asked a direct question. Did she regret what had happened? She tilted her head slightly, and it was clear the question genuinely surprised her, as if she had been asked something obvious or illogical. No, I did what I had to do. The interrogation continued for about 40 more minutes. Dates, details, the sequence of events. She answered everything, clearly, consistently, without contradictions or confusion in her testimony. The confession was recorded on camera and documented in a report. She never gave a motive. At least, not one that could be understood or explained from the standpoint of normal logic. She only said one phrase: "They deserved it." She wouldn't add anything more. And those two words, "they deserved it," would later be cited in all the materials on this case as an example of how distorted her perception of reality was. The investigation began digging into Mitchelle Brown's past. They searched for any explanation, something that would help understand how a person reaches this point. They found a lot of material, but not exactly what they were looking for. She was born in 1980 in South Detroit, a neighborhood where poverty was passed down as naturally as eye color or nose shape. She didn't know her father. He had left before she was born. Her mother worked 2 jobs and was hardly ever home. Mitchelle grew up essentially on her own, on the street, among others like her who weren't really being watched. She dropped out of school at 16. Later, her first pregnancy. The father disappeared a couple of months after the birth. A second pregnancy by another man. This one lasted a little longer, but also left in the end. After that, the same story. None of the men stayed by her side. By 25, she had 4 children, no education, and no permanent job. She lived on welfare, food stamps, and odd jobs. She moved every year or 2, either evicted for debt or moving out herself when problems piled up. 8 different addresses in 10 years. And characteristically, neighbors in the different places she lived remembered the same things. Withdrawn, suspicious, she talked to no one and didn't seek contact. If someone tried to speak to her, she answered in monosyllables and walked away. The younger ones rarely appeared in the yard. They had no friends. Social services received alerts 3 times. The first time in 2008, a neighbor reported hearing screams from the apartment. An inspection came, found nothing, and closed the case. The second time in 2010, the school noticed that one of the family members constantly came to classes hungry. A home visit, a conversation with the mother, a formal dismissal in the report. The third alert came in 2011, a year before the first case. An anonymous call complaining about noise and crying. An inspector arrived. No one opened the door. He returned a few days later. Everything was quiet. No signs of problems. The case was closed again. 3 alerts, 3 inspections, 0 real results. The investigation eventually pieced together a full picture of her life. Chronic poverty, social isolation, a total lack of support, and a system that repeatedly looked through its fingers at the warning signs. All of this explained the constant stress, explained the emotional breakdowns. To some extent, it even explained the use of force against her family. But it didn't explain the main thing. Why these 2? Why not all 4? What distinguished those who ended up in the freezer from those who stayed alive and lived to the moment the police knocked on the door? No answer to this question was ever found. The answer was found in the testimony of the eldest daughter. Not immediately. Investigators returned to her a few days later when the first interrogation of the mother hadn't really clarified anything. They asked directly, "Did the mother treat everyone the same?" The daughter shook her head. No, not the same. Not at all the same. There were 4 of them, But for the mother, they were divided into two categories. The younger son and the eldest daughter were one group, and those two who eventually ended up in the freezer were another entirely. The mother never spoke of this directly and explained nothing. But the difference was felt in literally everything. In how she looked at them, how she spoke to them, how she punished them for the slightest offenses. The investigator asked to clarify exactly how this difference manifested. The daughter was silent, choosing her words. And then she said a phrase that would later enter all the case files. She called them demons, and it is important to understand, not in a quarrel, not in a moment of anger or a breakdown, just like that, in ordinary conversation, like a name, like a statement of fact. Those two, or demons, for the mother, it was the same thing, interchangeable concepts. The daughter remembered how she once worked up the courage to ask, why? What did they do? Her mother looked at her with a long, heavy gaze and answered, you won't understand. They are different, bad. There's something dangerous inside them, and they need to be kept strictly, or they'll do harm. To whom specifically they would do harm, she didn't specify. What exactly was dangerous about them, she didn't explain. For her, it was so obvious that it required no proof or explanation, just a fact she knew, and the others had to take on faith. And there was one more detail the daughter told, before starting another punishment, each time with both. The mother said the same phrase. She didn't shout, didn't break into a scream. She spoke calmly, almost casually, looking into their eyes. I know who you really are. After these words, weeks of hunger, isolation, and abuse would begin. And then, the freezer. Investigators recorded the testimony. The picture was gradually coming together. In her mind, the mother had divided her own children into pure and impure. She considered two normal and two demons who needed to be gotten rid of. But why exactly these two fell into the category of demons and not the others still remained unclear. No logic, no explanation that could be understood from the perspective of a normal person. After this testimony, the investigation decided to order a full psychiatric evaluation, because what the daughter described already went far beyond the bounds of ordinary abuse or parental breakdowns. This was something else entirely. The evaluation took 2 weeks, 3 psychiatrists, a series of interviews, standard tests, a detailed analysis of behavior. Mitchelle Blair fully cooperated with the specialists, answered all questions, performed tasks, and refused nothing. She behaved calmly and rationally, like someone with nothing to hide. The conclusion? Sane. The experts detailed everything. She was fully aware of her actions at the time they were committed. She understood exactly what she was doing. She understood that it was illegal. She understood the consequences, both for her children and for herself. She was not in a state of insanity, clouded consciousness, or a psychotic episode. She acted systematically over a long period with full control over the situation. The diagnosis the experts gave: personality disorder with pronounced paranoid features. This meant high suspiciousness, a tendency to see a threat where none exists, rigidity of thinking. If she believed in something, it was almost impossible to dissuade her. Emotional coldness, a lack of empathy, and an inability to feel guilt for the harm caused. And here, it's important to understand the difference. This is not psychosis, not schizophrenia, not a state in which a person loses contact with reality and doesn't understand what is happening around them. she understood everything. Her understanding just worked by different rules. One of the experts wrote in his report a phrasing that would later be cited in the case files. The patient possesses a stable belief system that she considers absolutely true. These beliefs are not subject to correction. However, formally, they are not delusions in the clinical sense. She is capable of distinguishing right from wrong. It is just that her concept of right is radically different from the generally accepted one. To translate this into plain language, she knew what she was doing. She knew that society calls it a crime. She knew that there was a punishment prescribed for it, and she did it anyway, because in her own coordinate system, it was the right decision, necessary. What a mother must do to protect the family from the demons she saw in two of her own. The court accepted the expert's conclusion without objection. Mitchell Brown was found fully sane and fit to stand trial. This meant she would be held fully accountable for her actions, without any allowances for her mental state. The date for the first hearing was set for December of that same year. December 2015. Wayne County Circuit Court, courtroom number 4 on the second floor. The public benches are about half full. Journalists, a few local residents, a couple of law students who came to watch a real trial. The case never became a nationwide sensation. Detroit has seen plenty in its history, and it is hard to surprise anyone here. Mitchell Brown was led into the courtroom through a side door. Orange prison jumpsuit, handcuffs on her wrists, guards by her sides. She sat at the defense table and placed her hands in front of her. Her face was absolutely motionless, her gaze directed straight ahead. During the entire session, she never once turned her head, neither toward the public nor toward the jury. The prosecution presented 2 counts under a particularly serious statute. The prosecutor, a woman sharp with short grey hair, began with the chronology of events. March 2012, the first victim, a son. May 2013, the second victim, a daughter. The methods in both cases were the same: deprivation of food, harsh treatment, complete isolation from the outside world. Duration: several weeks in each case. Then they moved on to the autopsy results. The medical examiner recorded that both suffered from a complex of factors: extreme emaciation, dehydration, multiple injuries. Traces of recurring trauma were found on the bones. Some of them were old, already healed. Some were brand new. This meant the abuse had continued for a long time, well before those final weeks began. The prosecutor showed photos from the scene. The room fell silent. One of the jurors looked away. A woman in the first row covered her mouth with her hand and sat like that until the end of this part. Then, the testimony of the older daughter was read. The court decided not to call her in person, to avoid re-traumatizing her by reliving it all. The prosecutor read the transcript in a flat voice without any expression. And this monotony turned out to be scarier than any emotional intonation. Just dry facts, one after another, spoken as if it were a routine report. The defense remained silent throughout the entire hearing. The lawyer sat next to Mitchell and made some notes in a notebook. Not a single objection, not a single question for the witnesses or experts. What strategy he had chosen remained unclear for the time being. The session ended around 6 in the evening. The judge declared a recess until the next morning. After the audience began to disperse, the prosecutor approached the defense table and said a few words to the lawyer that no one present could hear. He nodded silently in response. The next morning, When the session resumed, the lawyer asked for the floor. And from that moment on, it became clear what line of defense he intended to build. The lawyer stood up and stated the prosecution had offered a deal. The terms were standard for such cases. The accused pleads guilty to both counts. In return, life imprisonment. But she listened in silence, staring straight ahead, and then turned to him and uttered a phrase, loudly enough for everyone present in the room to hear, "I have nothing to confess." The lawyer slowly leaned back in his chair. Nothing reflected on his face. A professional mask he had clearly practiced for years. But the hand holding the pen trembled slightly. And this moment spoke volumes. He understood what had just happened and how it would end for his client. The judge recorded the official refusal of the deal. He announced that the trial would continue in the usual manner, without any agreements between the parties. The prosecutor put the plea deal papers back in her folder. Before sitting down, she looked at Mitchell for a second, no longer. Mitchell did not look away. She stared back with the same motionless, expressionless face. The session moved to the closing arguments. But everyone in the room already understood the main thing. This woman was not going to defend herself in the usual sense of the word. She would not repent, would not ask for leniency, would not plead guilty. Because in her own picture of the world, there was nothing to admit to. She did what she thought was right, and no court could convince her otherwise. And that was exactly what made her truly terrifying. Not the abuse itself, but the absolute certainty of her own righteousness. Closing arguments took a day and a half. The prosecutor once again reconstructed the full chronology of events, repeated all the evidence, and demanded the maximum possible punishment. The defense tried to press on the defendant's difficult childhood, poverty, and the total lack of support from society and the state. But without a guilty plea, all of this sounded hollow, like an attempt to justify what is unjustifiable. The jurors listened with stony faces, and it was hard to tell from their expressions what they were thinking. Before the jury retired to deliberate, the judge addressed the accused. Standard procedure. The right to a final statement. You can remain silent, or you can speak and say something in your defense. Most defendants in such cases refuse. Lawyers usually advise not to take the risk, because any careless word can only worsen the situation. Mitchell Brown rose from her seat. The room instantly froze. The guard standing behind her took a small step closer, just in case. She paid no attention to it. She stood straight, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She looked directly at the judge, and then she spoke. In the same even voice everyone had already heard during the interrogations, without distress, without tears, without the slightest attempt to evoke pity or sympathy for herself. She stumbled slightly on the word, as if it took effort. Those two were evil, true evil. I saw it every day. I saw what they were doing. I saw who they really were behind all those faces. The judge listened in silence, not interrupting. The prosecutor froze with her pen in hand, forgetting to take notes. I did what I had to do. I protected my family. I protected those who could not protect themselves. It was my duty as a mother. She slowly looked around the entire room, the jurors in their box, the journalists with their notebooks, the random spectators in the back rows. And in that gaze, there was neither fear nor remorse, only calm, absolute certainty. You can condemn me. That is your right. I do not dispute it. But I know I did the right thing. And if everything were to happen again, if I found myself in the same situation, I would do the same thing, without hesitation. After these words, she calmly sat down and placed her hands on the table in front of her. Her face remained perfectly calm, without a shadow of emotion, as if she had just spoken of something mundane. Silence hung in the room. That special silence when people do not know how to react to what they have just heard. Then the judge cleared his throat and announced a recess for the jury's deliberation. And at that moment, it became finally clear to everyone present. This woman had not just committed a crime. She sincerely, with all her soul, believed she had performed a heroic deed. And that was exactly what made her final words so terrifying. Not the gravity of the act, but the complete lack of doubt in her own righteousness. The jury deliberated for only 40 minutes. For a case of such gravity, that is very little. Usually such discussions drag on for hours, sometimes an entire day. But here, everything was too obvious to argue for long. They returned with a verdict: guilty on both counts under the particularly serious statute. The judge handed down the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Exactly the sentence she could have avoided if she had accepted the deal. Now, that chance was gone. Mitchell and Brown listened to the sentence in silence, with the same motionless face everyone had seen throughout the process. Then she calmly stood up and allowed the guards to lead her out of the room. Not a word, not a gesture, not the slightest sign of emotion. The case was officially closed, but one question remained unanswered. Throughout the investigation and trial, she spoke of evil, of protecting the family, of knowing who her relatives really were. But not once, neither in interrogations, nor in the courtroom, nor in her final statement, did she say directly exactly what, in her opinion, those two had done, what specific evil she saw in them. After the sentencing, the journalists returned to their newsrooms, and the public quickly forgot about the case. Detroit is a city where tragedies happen too often to remember each of them for long, but the case files did not go anywhere. Hundreds of pages of transcripts, testimonies, and expert opinions, and among them, everything she had said to the investigators in the first days after her arrest, before a lawyer appeared, before the trial began, when she had not yet filtered her words or thought about how they would sound. Investigators had asked her this question many times, phrasing it as differently. Why? For what reason? What did they do? How did they wrong you? Each time she answered evasively. You wouldn't understand. They were different. I did what I had to do. General phrases that hid nothing specific. But once, at the very end of the third interrogation, the investigator phrased the question differently. Not, why did you do it? She had already answered that dozens of times, but differently. What specifically were you punishing them for? What did they do that was so bad they deserved this? And here she answered, in detail, at length, without avoiding the question. All of this was recorded in the transcript, word for word. This fragment of the interrogation was not read in court. There was no need, as guilt had already been fully proven by other materials. Therefore, it remained in the archival folders, in the volume of interrogations, on page 47. And there, on those pages, was her true explanation. What she sincerely believed. Why she had starved them for weeks, used force, and ultimately brought two of her own to a tragic end, and then kept what remained in a freezer in the middle of the living room. An explanation that showed what had been going on in her head all that time. Page 47. Third interrogation. The last 20 minutes of the recording. The investigator asks the question, "What were you punishing them for? What did they do?" A pause in the recording. 8 seconds of silence. Then her voice, as even and calm as ever. "They were doing evil to him, to my youngest, to their brother, something that put him in a vulnerable position." The investigator asked again, thinking he had misheard. She repeated it and added details. According to her, it had been happening constantly for several years. They did it when she wasn't looking. They hid. They chose their moments. But she knew anyway. She felt it. She saw it in his eyes, in their behavior, in the way they looked at each other at the dinner table. The investigator asked a direct question. Had she seen it with her own eyes even once? No, she hadn't. Had someone told her about it? No, no one had told her. Had the younger son complained or asked for help? No, he never complained. Then how did she know it was happening? A mother always knows. After this interrogation, the investigation began to check her words. The younger son was interviewed separately, in the presence of a psychologist, with all necessary precautions and according to all protocols for working with minors. He didn't understand what he was being asked at all. Nothing of the sort had ever happened. He loved his brother and sister, missed them, and all this time sincerely believed they had simply gone to stay with some relatives. They checked the medical records of everyone. No traces of anything like that. No characteristic injuries. Absolutely nothing that would indicate it. They interviewed the school, neighbors, distant relatives. No one had ever noticed anything suspicious in the relationships between them. They behaved like ordinary brothers and sisters. Nothing more. There was no evidence for what Mitchell Brown was saying, because the event itself did not exist. It never happened in reality. But in her head, everything looked completely different. There, 2 of her close ones were the ones causing evil, monsters, a threat from which she was obligated to protect the youngest at any cost. And this picture of the world determined all her actions throughout those terrible weeks. She didn't do it in a fit of rage. She didn't snap at some point or lose control of herself. Methodically, day after day, week after week, she punished them for what they had never done, for something that existed exclusively in her own head and nowhere else. And this is where everything finally comes together into a single picture. Demons, because in her perception, they were the source of evil. The division into 2 categories was a division into the protected and the guilty. A total lack of remorse, because in her version of reality, she saved her loved one from monsters. And those weeks of suffering before the end, that wasn't punishment in the usual sense. It was justice. She was passing judgment on those she considered guilty. She believed in this absolutely, without the slightest doubt. And, by all accounts, she continues to believe it to this day, sitting in a prison cell with a life sentence. For her, this story was never about what she did. It was a story about a mother who protected her loved one. And that is why she refused the deal. Why she did not plead guilty. Why in her final statement she said she would do it all again. In her world, she is not a criminal. She is a heroine.